In the year 1888, the town of Prosperity Creek, a jewel of the Montana silver boom nestled deep in the Garnet Range, vanished from the map. One day it was a bustling hub of 500 souls, with a new schoolhouse, 3 saloons, a hotel, and an assay office that weighed the dreams of ambitious men. The next, it was a ghost town. The official story, the one etched into the Scant County records and passed down as regional folklore, was simple. The silver was gone, and so were the people. They said the main vein, the sterling lode, had simply pinched out. In the harsh, pragmatic calculus of the West, a town without purpose was a town without a future. Families packed their wagons, miners shouldered their tools, and they all moved on, chasing the next rumor of a strike, leaving the buildings to the wind and the coyotes. It was a clean, quiet end, an unremarkable chapter in the boom and bust cycle of the frontier. But the truth was not clean, nor was it quiet. It was a secret buried under 135 years of soil and silence. And like all things buried, it was merely waiting. The vast, empty valley where Prosperity Creek once stood became a place of whispers, a sweeping expanse of sagebrush and bunchgrass under a sky too big and too empty. The foundations of the old buildings were faint scars on the land, visible only to the hawks that circled overhead. The story of its residents, their names and their faces, dissolved like sugar in water, becoming an anonymous part of the grand, romantic, and brutal myth of the American West. They would have forgotten, their final chapter written not by them, but by those who needed their story to end in a particular way. For over a century, that was enough. The world turned, cities rose, and the memory of a small silver town was ground to dust by the relentless march of progress. But in the spring of 2023, a diesel engine roared to life on the edge of that same valley, its sound an intrusion on a profound quiet. Progress had returned, not for silver, but for land. A backhoe, its yellow arm a stark contrast to the muted browns and greens of the landscape, began to dig, tearing into the earth to lay the foundation for a luxury housing development. The past was about to be violently disinterred. The history that had been so carefully curated and sealed away was about to meet the unthinking, indiscriminate force of a steel bucket. And a truth far more terrifying than a dried-up silver mine was about to claw its way into the light. The story of Prosperity Creek was not over. It had just been waiting for its first scream. The afternoon sun baked the Montana landscape, turning the construction site into a shimmering mirage of dust and heat. Dave Miller, the site foreman, wiped a sleeve across his forehead, tasting the grit on his lips as he watched the backhoe chew methodically at the earth. He was a man of simple objectives. Get the foundations poured before the next rains, keep the project on schedule, and get home in time for dinner. History was something for museums and books. Out here, the land was just dirt to be moved. The rhythmic crunch and scrape of the machine was the day's soundtrack, a dull and repetitive beat of progress. Then the rhythm broke. A loud, grating screech of metal on metal echoed across the valley, a sound utterly alien to this work of earth and stone. The backhoe operator killed the engine, and a sudden, ringing silence descended. Dave walked over, his boots sinking into the loose soil. The operator, a young man named Casey, pointed a gloved finger into the newly dug pit. "Hit something, boss," he said, his voice tight. "Something big. Iron by the sound of it." Dave peered down. For feet below the surface, the edge of a large, dark object was visible. It was rectangular, black with rust, and bound with thick iron straps. It was not a rock or a piece of forgotten farm equipment. It was a chest, a heavy, formidable, and ancient-looking trunk that had no business being there. A tremor of unease, cold and sharp despite the heat, ran through Dave. This wasn't a septic tank from an old homestead. This felt different. It felt deliberate. He called 2 of his men over, and with shovels and cautious hands, they began to clear the dirt around the object. An hour later, it was fully exposed, a massive, iron-bound chest, nearly 5 feet long and 3 feet wide, its surface pitted and corroded, but its form unnervingly intact. A heavy, complex-looking lock, sealed with a thick patina of rust, held it shut. This was no settler's trunk for clothes and keepsakes. This was a strong box, a vault. It was built to protect something, or perhaps to hide it forever. Protocol was clear. Dave pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the number for the county sheriff. This had just gone from a construction delay to a potential archaeological site, or worse, a crime scene. As he made the call, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had disturbed something that was meant to stay asleep. News of the discovery traveled fast, a digital wildfire hopping from local news affiliates to niche history forums online. For most, it was a fleeting curiosity, a quirky headline about a Wild West treasure chest. But for one man, it was a thunderclap. In his university office in Boulder, Colorado, surrounded by topographical maps and leather-bound books, Dr. Eris Thorne stared at the image on his computer screen. The photo, grainy and taken on a cell phone, showed the unearthed chest sitting in the back of a sheriff's pickup truck. Eris felt a jolt, a profound and electric shock of recognition that went beyond academic interest. For 15 years, Prosperity Creek had been his obsession, his great white whale. He had written his doctoral thesis on it, arguing against the accepted narrative. He had always felt the story was too simple, too clean. Towns died, yes, but not like this. Not without a trace. There were no scattered records of Prosperity Creek citizens showing up in other mining camps. No glut of families registering homesteads in the surrounding territories in the winter of 1888 or the spring of 1889. They had simply ceased to exist. His colleagues call it a romantic fixation, a historian's desire to find mystery where there was only mundane economics. But Eris had trusted his intuition, a gut feeling that a great injustice lay buried in that valley. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the answers to his every question were inside that iron box. He booked a flight to Montana before the sheriff's department had even figured out how to open it. The air in the evidence lockup of the Mineral County Sheriff's Department was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the history it now contained. The great iron chest sat in the center of the room on a steel table, a dark monolith from a forgotten age. Dr. Eris Thorne stood beside it, his hands gloved in nitrile, his breath misting slightly in the chilled air. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was a roadmap of long, hard seasons, watched him with a skeptical eye. After 2 days of meticulous work, a specialized locksmith had finally managed to defeat the ancient lock. The hinges, lubricated with penetrating oil, groaned in protest as Eris and a deputy lifted the heavy lid. The scent that rose from within was not decay, but of time itself, the dry, papery smell of old leather and well-kept secrets. Inside, there was no gold, no silver, no pirate's treasure. To the sheriff, it was a disappointment. To Eris, it was a motherlode. The contents were packed, with an almost desperate precision. On top lay several thick cloth-bound ledgers, their spines stamped in faded gold leaf. Prosperity Creek Assay Office, Sterling Mercantile, General Ledger, Hotel Grande accounts. Beneath them were stacks of documents tied with twine, business records, supply manifests, letters. And at the very bottom, nestled in a small oilcloth-wrapped bundle, was a single, smaller volume, a personal diary, its leather cover worn smooth with use. Eris felt his heart hammer against his ribs. This was the town's entire operational history, its lifeblood recorded in ink, sealed away from the world. So what's it all mean, Doc? Sheriff Brody asked, breaking the reverent silence. Looks like a bunch of old tax papers to me. Eris carefully lifted the top ledger, the one from the assay office. He opened it to the last few pages. His eyes scanned the columns of names, dates, and weights. This was the first anomaly, the first piece of evidence that the official story was a lie. The entries didn't dwindle. They didn't show a town in decline. In fact, they showed the opposite. The last recorded week, in late October of 1888, was one of the most productive in the town's history. The numbers were strong, the silver yields high. The sterling lode wasn't pinching out. It was booming. Sheriff, Eris said, his voice low and tight with excitement. This ledger shows that on October 28, 1888, the assay office processed over 300 pounds of high-grade silver ore. A town doesn't just pack up and leave a week after a strike like that. It's impossible. He began to move with a feverish energy, carefully laying out the documents on adjacent tables. He cross-referenced the mercantile's ledger with the hotel's account book. The pages told a story of a town brimming with life and commerce. The Sterling Mercantile had just received a massive shipment of winter supplies: flour, salt pork, wool blankets, and ammunition. The hotel was fully booked. People were not leaving. They were digging in, preparing for the harsh Montana winter, confident in their future. Why would a community invest so heavily in its immediate future if it planned to abandon it? The question hung in the cold air, a dissonant chord struck against the simple melody of the official history. The narrative of a simple economic bust was not just wrong. It was a deliberate fabrication. This chest was not a time capsule. Eris was beginning to understand. It was a witness box, sealed and buried, containing the testimony of a town that had been silenced. And he was now its sole juror, tasked with delivering a verdict a century and a half overdue. His gaze fell upon the small, leather-bound diary, still sitting at the bottom of the empty chest. The truth he suspected, the real human truth of what happened in Prosperity Creek, was waiting within its pages. The fluorescent lights of the university's archival library hummed over Dr. Eris Thorne's head, a monotonous sound for a monotonous task. For a week, he had done nothing but live in the year 1888. With high-resolution scans of the ledgers and documents from the chest, he had reconstructed the life of Prosperity Creek on his computer and on the massive corkboard that now dominated his office wall. He mapped out the town's businesses, its social networks, the flow of money and goods. Every piece of data he uncovered only deepened the central, nagging mystery. The town was not just viable, it was thriving, a model of success for its parent entity, the Sterling Mining and Land Company. This was the second layer of the deception, and it was colder and more calculating than the first. He turned his attention to the company and its founder, Silas Sterling. History had painted Sterling as a titan of industry, a visionary who tamed the West not with a gun, but with capital and ingenuity. His official biographies, sanctioned and promoted by the still powerful Sterling Corporation, spoke of a benevolent patriarch who built towns, laid railroad tracks, and brought civilization to the wilderness. He was a celebrated philanthropist whose name adorned university halls and hospital wings. But the records from Prosperity Creek suggested a different story. Eris found the original land deeds. In the first week of December 1888, every single private and commercial plot in Prosperity Creek, from the largest saloon to the smallest miner's shack, had been transferred to the Sterling Mining and Land Company. The transactions were all dated the same day, all signed over for the nominal fee of $1. It looked less like a series of sales and more like a mass forfeiture, a systematic consolidation of assets after the owners had conveniently disappeared. He cross-referenced this with the state's census records. The 1880 census showed 512 residents in Prosperity Creek. The 1890 census showed 0. There was no Exodus trail, no record of these 512 people appearing in the censuses of neighboring states, in Washington, Idaho, or Wyoming. It was as if they had been neatly and efficiently scooped off the face of the earth. He pulled up the corporate charter for the Sterling Company from 1885. The language was boilerplate, except for one clause Eris had previously overlooked, Clause 17B. It granted the company plenipotentiary authority over its designated townships in matters of public health and safety, allowing them to take any and all measures deemed necessary to protect corporate assets and personnel. It was a breathtaking grant of power, effectively turning company towns into private fiefdoms. Silas Sterling hadn't just owned the mine. He had owned the town, the people, everything. The image of the benevolent pioneer began to crack, revealing something far more ruthless beneath. The man was not a patriarch. He was a warden. The more Eris dug, the more he felt a palpable sense of menace emanating from the historical record. The Sterling Corporation's narrative was a fortress, built of ghost-written histories, philanthropic donations, and carefully curated public archives. The story of Prosperity Creek wasn't just a lie. It was a foundational stone of that fortress. To expose the truth of the town was to attack the very legacy of Silas Sterling and the powerful corporation that still bore his name. Eris pushed his chair back, the squeal of its wheels echoing in the silent library. He was no longer just a historian solving a puzzle. He was an investigator on the verge of accusing one of the nation's most revered historical figures of a monstrous crime. He needed more than data and ledgers. He needed a voice from the past. He needed a witness. His eyes were drawn back to the digital scan of the small, oilcloth-wrapped diary on his screen. It was time to hear its testimony. The digital facsimile of the diary on Eris Thorne's monitor was so clear he could see the faint water stain on the corner of the leather cover and the subtle impression of the writer's hand on the page. The title page was inscribed with neat cursive hand. Elias Vance, M.D., A Journal of Life and Practice, Prosperity Creek, Montana Territory, 1888. Eris felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with a somber reverence. He was about to invade the most private thoughts of a man dead for 135 years. He scrolled to the first entry. The early pages were exactly what he expected. A doctor's chronicle of life in a frontier town. Dr. Vance wrote of setting broken bones for clumsy miners, delivering babies, and treating coughs and fevers. He described the crisp mountain air, the boisterous energy of the town, on a Saturday night, and the quiet dignity of its families. He mentioned the O'Connell family by name, noting his treatment of their young son, Liam, for a bout of croup. The boy has his mother's spirit, Vance wrote. He fought the sickness with a stubborn fire. A good Irish family, hard-working and full of hope. The entries painted a portrait of a community that was rough around the edges, but fundamentally decent and optimistic. They were not transient fortune seekers, but people building lives, investing their sweat and their savings into a shared future. Eris read for hours, completely immersed, the world of his office fading away, replaced by the sounds and smells of a town he was beginning to know intimately. Then, on the page dated September 15th, 1888, the tone shifted. The change was subtle at first, a single entry that stood apart from the others. Saw Thomas Riley today, a young Cornish man from the deep shaft, complaining of a persistent headache, fever, and a debilitating weakness. His wife said he's had a violent stomach complaint for a week. I prescribe rest and fluids, but his symptoms are troubling. There's a look in his eyes I do not like. A week later, another entry. 2 more men from the same mining shift came to me today. Miller and Chun. Identical symptoms to Riley. Fever, prostration, a spreading rash of rose-colored spots on their abdomens. I've sent a water sample from the communal well near their boarding house for testing, but it will take weeks to get a result from Helena. I fear this may be typhoid. Eris felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He knew the history of typhoid in the 19th century. It was a terrifying, indiscriminate killer, spread by contaminated water or food. In a crowded mining camp with primitive sanitation, an outbreak would be a catastrophe. Dr. Vance's entries became more frequent, his handwriting growing more hurried, more desperate. September 30th, Thomas Riley is dead. His wife is now sick. Miller is delirious. I've confirmed for more cases, including 2 children. I sent a rider to the Sterling Company regional office in Anaconda, begging for medical supplies. Carbolic acid, clean water barrels, more quinine. I have demanded they alert the territorial authorities. October 5th, it is spreading. 10 new cases today. The hotel has become a makeshift infirmary. We are running out of everything. The O'Connell's daughter, little Maeve, has the fever now. I see the terror in their eyes. It is a mirror of my own. No word from the company. The rider has not returned. October 10th, a rider arrived today, not with medicine, with a message. Eris leaned closer to the screen, his breath held tight in his chest. Dr. Vance's script was now a barely controlled scrawl, the ink smudged in places as if by a trembling hand. The company's response is not one of aid, but a containment. The regional manager, a Mr. Bishop, has replied on behalf of Silas Sterling himself. He writes that to prevent a panic that would damage investor confidence in the stability of the territory, no news of the outbreak is to leave the valley. They are not sending doctors. They are sending guards. The words hit Eris like a physical blow. This wasn't negligence. This was a deliberate, calculated act of imprisonment. The pieces snapped into place with sickening clarity. The thriving ledgers, the winter supplies, the confidence of the town, it all took on a horrifying new meaning. They weren't preparing for winter. They were trapped unknowingly on the eve of their own destruction, their fate sealed not by a bacterium, but by a balance sheet. The doctor's journal became a descent into hell. Eris read on, a helpless voyeur to a tragedy unfolding in slow, agonizing detail. Dr. Vance's entries were no longer just medical notes. They were a testament to a betrayal so profound it defied comprehension. October 12th, Vance wrote, his script shaky. They have arrived. 12 men, armed with Winchester rifles. They are not company men I recognize. Hard-faced, cold-eyed. They have set up roadblocks on the only 2 roads out of the valley. They call it a protective quarantine. It is a prison. A letter from Bishop, delivered by their leader, made the company's position brutally clear. Prosperity Creek is now under Sterling Company martial law. Any attempt to breach the quarantine will be met with lethal force. They say it is for the good of the territory. It is for the good of the stock price. The Journal chronicled the town's swift and terrible decay. The sickness, unchecked, burned to the population. The healthy were forced to tend to the dying, only to fall sick themselves. The winter supplies that had seemed so plentiful were now hoarded, rationed, and fought over. The bustling, hopeful town heirs had come to know through the ledgers devolved into a charnel house of fear and suspicion. Vance's writing captured the horrifying intimacy of the disaster. October 20th. Buried 4 more today in the makeshift plot up on the ridge. We are running out of space and the strength to dig. Young Liam O'Connell, help me carry the last one. The boy is gaunt, but the fire I saw in him is still there, banked to a low coal of terror. His sister, Maeve, is fading. His parents can do nothing but watch. I gave them my last vial of laudanum, not as a cure, but as a mercy. The Sterling Mining and Land Company was not just an absent landlord. It was an active participant in the town's demise. The guards did not offer aid. They only patrolled the perimeter, their rifles a constant, silent threat. They were there to ensure that the secret of Prosperity Creek died with its residents. Vance described a desperate attempt by a group of miners to break through the cordon one night. Heard shots from the North Road around midnight. A volley, then silence. The next morning, the guards made it known that 3 men were killed. They left the bodies where they fell as a warning. Hope, what little remained, died with them. The O'Connell family became the emotional anchor of the tragedy. Vance, overwhelmed and undersupplied, visited them daily, his entries a painful record of their decline. October 25th. Little Maeve passed this morning. So peaceful it was cruel. Her mother has not spoken a word since. Her father, a man of such strength, just sits by the window, staring out at the mountains that have become their cage. Liam asked me if his sister is an angel now. I did not know how to answer him. What kind of God would allow this? Eris had to push his chair away from the desk, his stomach churning. He felt a suffocating rage, a deep and personal grief for these people he had never met. The myth of the Wild West, of rugged individualism and manifest destiny, was a cruel joke in the face of this calculated, corporate-sponsored slaughter. Silas Sterling, the celebrated visionary, had not built a town. He had built a cage and then lit on fire to protect his investment. This was a harsh reality of the frontier that no one wanted to admit. That the greatest dangers were not the elements or the natives, but the unchecked greed of powerful men who saw people as nothing more than entries in a ledger. The most powerful weapon in the West wasn't the Colt revolver. It was the corporate charter. The final entries in Dr. Vance's journal were written with a failing hand. The ink faint, the letters sprawling across the page as his strength gave out. He knew he was dying. The typhoid that he had fought so valiantly in others had finally claimed him. Yet, in his final days, he was consumed by a single defiant purpose, to ensure the truth would not be buried with him. November 5th, the entry began a near illegible scrawl. The silence is the worst part. The town is nearly empty now. The living are too weak to tend to the dead. The guards remain. They watch. They wait. Bishop's orders are clear. Wait for it to be over. Then cleanse the site. Erase us. It was in this entry that Vance detailed his final, desperate act of preservation. He described how he'd spent 2 days gathering the town's most important records. The assay ledgers that proved its wealth, the mercantile accounts that showed its vitality, the hotel registry filled with the names of the doomed. He knew the Sterling Company would destroy every shred of evidence that contradicted their coming narrative. These papers were the town's last will and testament. I have collected it all, he wrote. Everything that proves we were alive, that we thrived, and that we were murdered by indifference and greed. I have packed it, along with this journal, into Yasay office's iron chest. It is the only thing in this town strong enough to survive what is coming. I will hide it in the small cellar beneath the floorboards. Perhaps one day, a soul with a conscience will dig here. Eris stared at the words, his heart aching with the weight of that hope, a hope that had lain dormant in the dark for 135 years, until a backhoe disturbed its slumber. The doctor's final act was not one of surrender, but of faith, a belief that truth was a tangible thing that could be preserved and, eventually, unearthed. The last entry was dated November 8, 1888. It was just a few words. Liam O'Connell came to my door. Both parents gone now. He is alone. The last one, he brought me water. Good boy. The fire is out. Eris closed his eyes. The story was complete. The mass grave Dave Miller's crew had uncovered was not the site of violent massacre, but the final, exhausted resting place of the dead, buried by the last few survivors before they, too, succumbed to sickness and starvation. Once the last person, a young boy named Liam, was gone, the Sterling Company's cleanup crew would have moved in, under the direction of the ruthless Mr. Bishop. They would have burned what they could, buried what they couldn't, and dismantled the town structure by structure. They would have scrubbed the records, filed the falsified land deeds, and planted the simple, plausible story of mine that ran dry. It was a perfect corporate crime, executed with chilling efficiency and hidden behind the towering reputation of Silas Sterling. Eris now held the weapon that could bring that reputation crashing down. He had the motive, the method, and the confession. The ledgers proved the town was profitable. The land deeds showed the consolidation of assets. And the doctor's journal provided the harrowing, unimpeachable testimony of a witness. He leaned back, the enormity of his responsibility settling upon him. He was no longer just an academic. He was Dr. Vance's conscious soul, the instrument of promise made in the final, desperate hours of a dying town. It was time to make the world listen. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for the investigative desk at the New York Times. The story broke like a dam. The New York Times ran on the front page. Buried ledgers and a doctor's diary reveal 19th century corporate massacre. The article, co-authored by their top investigative reporter and citing Dr. Eris Thorne extensively, laid out the entire harrowing tale of Prosperity Creek. It was a meticulous, damning indictment, presenting the scanned pages of the ledgers and the most heartbreaking excerpts from Dr. Vance's journal. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The Sterling Corporation, now a multi-billion-dollar global logistics and resource conglomerate known as Sterling Global, was caught completely off guard. Their initial response was clumsy and dismissive, a brief press release calling the story a sensationalist reinterpretation of historical events based on unverified documents. But the evidence was too compelling, the narrative too horrific to be brushed aside. The corporation's fortress of reputation began to crumble. They quickly shifted tactics, deploying a high-powered crisis management team from New York. A press conference was called. A slick, silver-haired spokesman, the company's executive VP of communications, stood at a podium flanked by lawyers. He did not attempt to refute the existence of the documents. Instead, he sought to discredit their meaning and the man who had brought them to light. While this is a tragic, if obscure, historical event, the narrative being pushed by Dr. Thorne is one of wild speculation. The spokesman said, his tone dripping with condescending sympathy. He is a little-known academic, likely seeking to make a name for himself. A doctor's private journal, written under extreme duress and illness, can hardly be considered an objective historical account. It is a product of a fevered mind, not a factual record. The confrontation was on. Eris, who had been watching the press conference from his university office, felt a surge of cold fury. They were trying to do to him what they had done to the memory of Prosperity Creek. Erase him, dismiss him, bury him under the weight of their authority. He agreed to a live television interview that evening. Facing the camera, he was not the excitable academic his critics portrayed. He was calm, focused, and armed with indisputable facts. The Sterling Global spokesman suggests Dr. Vance's journal is unreliable, Eris stated, looking directly into the lens. But the journal is not the only evidence. It is the key that unlocks the rest of the evidence. It explains why the town's assay ledgers show record profits the week before it vanished. It explains why every single land deed was transferred to the Sterling Company on the same day for $1. And it explains this. He held up a document for the camera. This is a Sterling Company purchase order from October of 1888, which I uncovered in the Montana State Archives last week. It is a requisition for 12 armed guards, 5,000 feet of barbed wire, and 20 crates of Winchester ammunition to be delivered to a temporary post at the mouth of the valley leading to Prosperity Creek. It is signed by Mr. Alastair Bishop, Silas Sterling's regional manager. They weren't sending help. They were building a prison. The purchase order was a final nail in the coffin. It was a corroborating, objective proof that transformed Dr. Vance's diary from a tragic story into a verified account of a corporate atrocity. The lawyers and PR men could not explain it away. The carefully constructed myth of Silas Sterling, the benevolent pioneer, was shattered in an instant, live on national television. The fallout was immense. The story of Prosperity Creek dominated the news cycle for weeks. Silas Sterling went from being a name synonymous with progress and philanthropy to one synonymous with corporate evil. Statues were questioned, university buildings were renamed, and the Sterling global stock price plummeted as investors grappled with the company's monstrous origins. The public outcry was deafening, a roar of collective outrage that demanded accountability, even across the chasm of 135 years. The Sterling Global Board, facing a crisis of existence, was forced into a series of concessions. They issued a formal public apology, acknowledging the unconscionable actions of their founder and the 19th century company leadership. They fired the PR team that had attacked Eris Thorne and established a massive fund dedicated to historical preservation and restorative justice projects. For Eris, however, the true victory was not in the corporate world's frantic damage control. It was in the quiet, painstaking work that followed. Using the hotel registry and mercantile accounts from the chest, he, along with a team of genealogists, began the monumental task of tracing the descendants of the 512 residents of Prosperity Creek. They were scattered across the country, families who had no idea how or why their great-great-grandparents had simply disappeared from the family tree. The calls Eris made were some of the most difficult and emotional of his life. He spoke to a teacher in Oregon, a descendant of the town blacksmith, a mechanic in Ohio whose ancestors had run the livery stable, and, in a call that left him breathless, he found the great-grandnephew of the O'Connell family, a retired firefighter living in Boston, who had a faded photograph of two solemn-faced children, Liam and Maeve, that had been passed down through a different branch of the family that had immigrated separately. The unveiling was complete. The forgotten had been found. The layers of deception had been peeled back to reveal not just a crime, but the faces of its victims. Silas Sterling's carefully crafted legacy was exposed as a hollow monument built on the unmarked graves of those he had deemed disposable. The narrative of the benevolent company town was replaced by the stark truth of a death camp, enforced by men with rifles to protect a number on a stock ticker. The misleading narrative of a simple economic bust was now a case study in historical gaslighting. The intuitive feeling that had driven Eris for so long was vindicated, his faith in the small, persistent voice of a forgotten doctor justified. He had listened, and by listening, he had given the silence a voice that now echoed across a century. The truth, as Dr. Vance had prayed, had finally come out. A late autumn sun cast long shadows across the valley. Where Dave Miller's backhoe had once torn at the earth, there was now a quiet, consecrated space. A simple, elegant memorial of polished black granite stood on the ridge, overlooking the faint, grassy outlines of where the town's main street had been. Etched into the stone were 512 names, rescued from the oblivion of Dr. Vance's ledgers. The name O'Connell was there, with Liam and Maeve inscribed beneath. At the bottom, a final, separate name, Elias Vance, M.D., he remembered. A crowd of several hundred people was gathered. They were the descendants, the families brought together by a tragedy they never knew they shared. The teacher from Oregon stood next to the firefighter from Boston. Sharing quiet words, their faces a mixture of sorrow and profound connection. Dr. Eris Thorne stood at the edge of the crowd, not as a speaker or a guest of honor, But as an observer, he felt no sense of triumph, no academic pride. He felt only a deep, somber sense of closure. He had not been the hero of this story. He had simply been the messenger, the one lucky enough to find the bottle that had washed ashore after more than a century at sea. The ceremony was simple. A local historian spoke of the town's brief life. A descendant of one of the miners read a passage from the Psalms. The great-grandnephew of the O'Connells laid a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the stone. There was a quiet power in the gathering, a collective act of remembrance that finally, definitively, overwrote the lie. The Sterling Corporation's money had paid for the memorial, but their name was nowhere on it. Their penance was to be erased from the final chapter, just as they had tried to erase the first. As the crowd began to disperse, leaving small tokens and flowers on a granite ledge, Eris walked up to the memorial. He ran his fingers over the engraved name of Elias Vance. The doctor had died believing his efforts were in vain, his last act a desperate gamble against eternity. Yet, here was the proof that it had mattered. His voice had been heard. Eris looked out across the vast, silent landscape. The harsh reality of the Wild West was not about cowboys and shootouts. It was about power and powerlessness. It was about whose story gets told and whose gets buried. The romantic myth, he now knew for certain, was the most dangerous lie of all, because it papered over the crimes of the powerful and made heroes out of monsters. But today, in this quiet valley, a different kind of story had been told. A story of resilience, of truth, and of a promise kept. The resolution was not one of victory, but of peace. The souls of Prosperity Creek could finally rest, their names returned to the light, their memory no longer forgotten. And for Eris Thorne, there was a quiet, hopeful realization that history is never truly over. It sleeps, it waits, and sometimes, against all odds, it awakens to demand justice.